He hit her on the stage, not backstage, not in her apartment, not in a hotel corridor, not somewhere private where it could be explained away later. On the stage of the New Amsterdam Theatre, in front of the crew, in front of the other girls, in front of anyone who happened to be standing in the wings. He did it the way he did everything else in front of an audience, like it was nothing, like she was a prop he'd grown tired of. I was there. I had brought something she'd forgotten, a pair of gloves or a hair clip. I don't remember anymore. I was standing just off the wing, and I saw his hand, and I saw her head turn, and I saw her take a step back and then find her footing and stand still. She stood still. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. The girls around her found somewhere else to look. The stagehands found something to do. And Frank Tinney walked to the other side of the stage like a man who has just set down a glass. Nobody moved. I have asked myself for 50 years why nobody moved. Starting with me. Nobody moved then. Subscribe to Old Money Widows, and don't look away. Her real name was Imogene Robertson, born in Louisville, Kentucky, into a family that didn't have much beyond each other. She came to New York the way a lot of girls did in those years, alone, with a plan she'd made herself, with nothing to fall back on if the plan didn't hold. She had a face that stopped people in the street, not in a showy way. There was something in it that was still, the way deep water is still. Those blue eyes that seemed to be looking at something slightly past wherever she was. Photographers understood her before directors did. Before she was in the Follies, she was an artist's model. James Montgomery Flagg sketched her. Arthur William Brown drew her, men who knew faces for a living. By the time I came to work for her, she was Imogene Bubbles Wilson, Ziegfeld girl, 21 years old, one of the most talked about women in New York City. A columnist named Mark Hellinger wrote in 1922 that there were only two people in America who could bring every reporter in New York City to the docks just to watch them sail. One was the president. The other was Imogene Wilson. She read that to me one morning while I was pressing her costume. Read it straight through, folded the paper, set it down. Then she said, very quietly, not sad, just factual, "I wonder if he'd still write that if he knew where I was born." That was her. Precisely her. The papers made her into something glittering. A jazz-age girl who wanted nothing but champagne and applause. She was those things. She loved the stage the way some people love oxygen. She lit up under the lights in a way you couldn't manufacture. But she was also serious in the way women who've built their own lives always are. She paid her own rent. She kept a budget. She sent money home to Kentucky. She was funny at dinner and careful with money in the morning, and the newspapers only ever printed the dinner. She was kind to me in the way that counts. Not grand about it. She just learned my preferences. She asked after my family. One week I was sick, and she told me to stay home and paid me anyway. Which was not the custom. And she was aware it wasn't the custom. And she said nothing about it. She just did it. I want you to hold her in your mind before what comes next. Because what comes next is the story everyone knows. The scandal. The courtroom. The headlines that called her shameless and said she brought it on herself. What nobody printed was the woman who held her coffee with both hands at the window in the early morning. The woman who was 21 years old and had made herself entirely out of her own effort. The woman who had not yet met the man who would spend 2 years taking her apart. I want to tell you something about that man before I tell you who he was. The first time I saw Frank Tinney in her apartment, he brought flowers. A grand arrangement. The kind you send to a dressing room on an opening night, not the kind you bring to a woman's home on a Tuesday evening. He set them on the table, and he looked around the apartment the way a man looks at a property he's considering purchasing. Just a sweep of the room, a calculation. She was so pleased to see him. That's the thing I've come back to more times than I can say. How pleased she was. How she came out of the kitchen already smiling before she'd opened the door all the way, like the sound of his knock was enough. I excused myself. But I stood in the kitchen, and I listened to them through the wall, and there was something in the sound of the room that I did not have words for at the time. I have words for it now. Frank Tinney was one of the most beloved entertainers in America. That fact is load-bearing. Everything that happened later depends on understanding that fact first. Joe Cook, himself one of the great comics of the era, said publicly that Tinney was the greatest natural comic ever developed in America. Audiences at the New Amsterdam Theatre roared for him. He had a way of breaking the scene mid-performance, turning to talk to the orchestra conductor, improvising something that made the whole house lean forward. It wasn't a trick. It was genuine instinct. He'd been doing it since vaudeville, since before Broadway, since he was a young man from Philadelphia who'd talked his way onto a stage at Keith's and never come back off. By 1922, he was pulling $1,500 a week. At his peak. I am telling you this because it matters. A man like that doesn't just have a crowd behind him. He has credibility. He has friends in rooms that close to the public. He has a face that New York City has looked at for decades and decided it likes. When something happens later, when a woman reports something, you need to understand what she was reporting it against. He was charming in the apartment. That was the thing that confused what I was seeing for a long time. He could walk in on a good evening and have the whole room alive in 10 minutes. Stories about the road, impressions of theatre producers done with his whole body, the kind of warmth that a man either has or he doesn't and can't fake. On those nights, I could see exactly what she loved about him. But by 1922, I had learned to read the difference between his early evening drinking and his later evening drinking. That is not a small skill. It is something you develop when you have to. He was jealous in a way that had nothing to do with love. There's a distinction there I need you to understand. The jealousy that comes from caring for someone feels like fear. The fear of loss. The fear of being replaced. What he had was different. It was the jealousy of ownership. She was beautiful, and she was sought after, and he wanted it understood, by her, by every man in any room she entered, that she belonged to him. When she received flowers from an admirer, he noted it. When she spoke to another man at a cast party, briefly, professionally, he brought it up afterward. Not loudly. In the apartment, later. In a voice low enough that no one else would hear. That low voice. I came to understand it the way you understand weather. She tried to manage it. That's what I watched her do for 2 years. The management. What dress would calm him. What she should and shouldn't say about her day. How long she should wait before speaking after he'd been drinking. The mental arithmetic of a woman who has learned that peace is not something that exists in her home. It is something she has to produce every single day, from whatever material is available. She made herself smaller and smaller in the ways she thought would help. They never helped. What I saw next, what I watched happen over the winter of 1923, I never told anyone. Until now. There was an evening that summer when he arrived later than he'd said he would, drunker than I'd seen him in months. I was still in the apartment. She'd asked me to stay for something. I don't recall what. I was in the back room. I heard the front door. I heard him moving through the apartment too heavily. And I heard her voice shift. She had a voice she used with him when he was like that. Lower. Slower. The voice of someone who is moving very carefully around something that might tip. I wanted to go in. I stood in that back hall, and I wanted to walk through that door and say something, anything, that would change the shape of that room. I stayed where I was. I have spent a long time deciding whether that made me a coward. I have not finished deciding. There are things I saw that I never told the magistrate. There are things I never told anyone. Until this. I saw her cover a bruise. Once before May 1924. Once that I am certain of. It was 1923. I came into her room in the morning with her coffee, and she was at the dressing table, working powder into the side of her jaw with her fingers. Carefully, methodically. The way you work powder when you've done it before, when you know what you're covering and how much coverage it needs. She saw me in the mirror. Her hands went still. She said, "I walked into the doorframe in the dark." I said, "Yes, miss." She held my eyes in the mirror for a moment. Then she went back to the powder. I set the coffee down. I left the room. I went back into the hallway, and I stood there. And I did not go back in. And I did not say what I was thinking. And I have thought about that moment many more times than I've told anyone. Later that same year, I watched him reach for a glass behind her. Nothing more than that, just reaching past her on the sideboard. And her whole body went small, quick, reflexive, like a hand pulled back from a hot surface. She caught herself almost immediately and covered it, straightened, kept talking. He didn't see it, or he didn't react to it. I was across the room. I saw her body do what a body does when it has learned to be afraid. She went on talking like nothing had happened. I closed the door of the kitchen, and I stood in there for a while. In the late winter of 1924, I watched her try to put distance between them. Not openly. She was too careful for that. She simply started being unavailable. Not at home when he came by, busy in the evenings. I could see her building the architecture of an exit, brick by brick, quiet and slow. He noticed inside of 2 weeks. One afternoon he arrived without warning. He did that, turned up unannounced, which I had come to understand was not accidental. And I watched her face when she opened the door. It changed, not dramatically. Just the way a window changes when a cloud moves across the sun. And then she recovered it, fully, in less than a second, and she smiled and stood aside to let him in. He stayed 3 hours. I heard the register of their conversation without hearing the words, rising and falling, his voice louder than hers staying low and careful. When he finally left, she sat in the armchair by the window, and she did not move. I brought her tea. She didn't drink it. When she eventually got up and started moving through the apartment again, I noticed she was carrying her left arm differently, close to her body. Gently. The way you carry something that has been damaged. She said she was fine. The next morning she was at the dressing table. I set down her coffee. I looked at her in the mirror. And here is the moment I come back to most, more than the night in May, more than the grand jury. She looked back at me, and we both knew, and neither of us said a word about it. I turned and walked out. I want you to understand something about that decision that the newspapers never captured and the courtroom never asked about. I was not indifferent. I was not passive. I was a black woman working in a white woman's apartment in New York City in 1923. And I was watching a white man with a Broadway career and a Long Island home do something that I already knew in my body, the way you know things you'd rather not, that no one was going to stop. I had done the arithmetic before May. The arithmetic was the same after May. The arithmetic never changed. By the spring of 1924, I had made a decision I didn't know I'd made. I had stopped believing that saying something would help. What happened in May is partly the result of that decision. May 24th, 1924. She had a reporter in the apartment, a man from the press she knew professionally. Nothing more than that. They were talking. I was in the back room. I heard the front door earlier than expected. I heard Frank's step in the hallway, heavy, uneven, and I knew before the door was fully open. He came in. He saw the reporter. And something in him, the part that had always been looking for a reason, found what it was looking for. I heard him order the man out. I heard the reporter go, quickly, which was the right instinct. I heard the front door close. And then I heard the lock. That lock. I have never been able to get that sound out of my head. The click of it. So ordinary. The sound a door makes in 1,000 apartments every night. And yet in that room, in that moment, it was the sound of everything becoming unavoidable. I stayed in the back room. I want to tell you plainly what I was doing. I was pressing myself against the wall, and I was not breathing loud enough to be heard. And I was counting the things I could hear from the other room and trying not to count them. Her voice, first. That low, careful voice, the one she used when she was navigating him. Then his voice, past the register where reasoning is possible. Then, and this is the part I will not soften, the sound of what happens when a man stops using words. I knew he was in the apartment. I knew she was in the next room. I stayed where I was. I am not going to explain to you why, because you either understand why or you don't. And I cannot change what the year was, or what my position was, or what I already knew about what happened to women like me who put themselves in the path of men like him. I can only tell you that I stayed where I was, and I have carried that. At some point, I don't know how much time had passed, I heard him move toward the back of the apartment. He came into the hall where I was. He looked at me. The expression on his face was not anger, and it was not guilt, and it was not anything complicated. It was irritation. The specific irritation of a man who has found an inconvenience in a room he thought was empty. Then he struck me, once, across the side of my head, and he walked away, back through the apartment. I heard the front door open and close. I stood with my palm flat against the wall for a moment. Then I went into the main room. This is what I saw in that hallway. This is what I couldn't tell you in full at the beginning. She was on the floor. She had pulled herself to sitting with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up. Her hair had come down entirely. There was blood at her temple. Not a great deal, but blood. The bruises on her head and arms were already past the point of hiding. She'd tried to protect herself. I could see where she'd tried. She looked up at me. Neither of us said anything. Then she said, "I'm all right," I said. "No, miss, you're not." She closed her eyes. She stayed with her back against the wall for a long time. I sat on the floor across from her. I made her tea eventually. I helped her wash her face. I sat with her until she fell asleep in the armchair. She wouldn't go into the bedroom. And then I went into the kitchen, and I sat there alone in the dark, and I thought, I need to tell you what I found out later, because it didn't reach me until the next day. After he left that night, after he left her on the floor in that apartment, she attempted to end her life. She had tried to die. I didn't know that when I was sitting in her kitchen in the dark. I found out after. When I found out, something shifted in me. Not broke. Shifted. Because it meant I'd been sitting 10 feet away from a woman who was in the worst night of her life, and I had made her tea and helped her wash her face, and then gone into the next room and sat with my own calculations. And I hadn't known what I was sitting 10 feet away from. I don't know what I would have done if I'd known. I'd like to believe I would have acted differently. But I don't know. In the morning, she got up before I expected her to. She dressed carefully. She arranged her hair in a way that covered what it could cover. She walked into the kitchen and she poured herself a cup of coffee and she stood at the window. West 72nd Street below, early light, the city already moving. And she held that cup in both hands and she stood still. She didn't know I was watching from the doorway. She stood there long enough that I understood she was making a decision. I watched her make it. 4 days later, May 28th, she walked into the office of New York City Magistrate Thomas McAndrews. I went with her. I had a bruise on the side of my head I had not covered. She had bruises on her head and body she had not covered either. We told the magistrate what had happened. Tinney was arrested at his home in Baldwin, Long Island, the next morning. I stood in that office and I told the truth. And a voice somewhere in me, a naive voice, a voice I have since had to educate, said, "Now it will matter." June 1924, the grand jury. We both testified. She told them what he did to her. I told them what I saw and what was done to me. She had bruises that had been documented. I had a bruise any juror in that room could have seen with his own eyes. 2 women, 1 story, consistent, supported by physical evidence. The grand jury refused to indict him. They cited a lack of evidence. I need you to hold those 2 things at the same time. The bruises that were in that room and the verdict that said there wasn't enough to proceed. Hold both of those things and ask yourself what kind of room produces that result. Frank Tinney had been a Broadway star for over a decade. He had performed at the New Amsterdam Theatre for Florenz Ziegfeld. He had a wife, a son, a Long Island home, a face the city had decided it loved. He was, in every category that courtrooms cared about in 1924, credible. We were 2 women, one of them a showgirl whose association with a married man had already been in the papers for months, whose character had therefore already been made complicated for any jury that read a newspaper, and one of them a maid whose name appeared in the record without a last name, as simply maid. Afterward, Tinney told reporters the entire thing had been a publicity stunt she'd invented. He beat her badly enough that she tried to die afterward. He struck me in her hallway. Both of us walked into that room and told the same story with our bodies as evidence. And the story the public was handed, the story that was allowed to stand, was that she had staged it. When we came out of that building, she didn't cry. I want you to notice that, because people always expect tears. She didn't cry. She walked out into the street, and she stopped on the pavement, and she looked at the traffic, and her face was, I don't have a word for it that isn't too large. It was the face of someone who has just confirmed something she'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to know. She had done everything correctly. She had reported it. She had shown the evidence. She had brought a witness. She had gone through every official door that women are told to walk through when this happens. None of the doors led anywhere. This is the part where I have to be honest about what I did afterward. Because I have spent time blaming myself, and I have spent time defending myself, and neither of those positions is quite true. The morning she put on her coat to go to the magistrate, the morning before any of the testimony, before the jury, before any of it, I was standing beside her, and I could see that she was frightened. Not just of him, of what was coming, of what it was going to cost her to walk out that door and say publicly what had been done to her privately. She was 21 years old. She was about to face a city that had already decided it had an opinion about her. I said, "You look fine, miss." She said, "I don't feel fine." I said, "I know." And we went. That's the whole of it. That's everything I gave her before she walked into the hardest thing she'd ever have to do. I gave her. I know. I have asked myself, in every year since, whether there was something more I could have said, something that would have told her I understood the size of what she was doing, something that would have made her feel less alone in that hallway. I don't know if it would have changed anything. I know it would have been more than what I gave her. There are things I saw, and there are things I only heard about later, through other people, the way news travels when you are no longer in the room. I was not in the room when Ziegfeld fired her. What I know is this: after the grand jury, she and Tinney reconciled. I don't judge that. I have stopped judging that a long time ago. The system had told her that her report was worthless, that the evidence of her own body was insufficient, that the man who hurt her was not guilty of hurting her. And he came back, and he was sorry, and he was the person she loved, and the city had taken everything else from her. What I know about women in that position, what I learned from watching her, is that returning is not weakness. It is the only door left in the room. They were photographed together outside a Broadway theatre in August. That photograph reached Florenz Ziegfeld. He fired her that same day. His statement to the press: she had promised to end the relationship. She had broken her promise. He had discharged her to prevent disruption to his cast's morale. Not, she had been beaten. Not, she had gone to the law. Not, the law had failed her and left her alone with a man who hurt her, and she had done what human beings do when they are alone and afraid. The official reason she lost her career, the permanent, documented, public reason, was that she had been seen standing on a sidewalk with him. On August 6th, 1924, the same day he sailed for England on the Columbus ocean liner, she was at the docks. She was escorted off the ship by crew when she wouldn't leave at the departure whistle. She stood on the dock and she wept, and the reporters were there, all of them, and they wrote down every word. She said he was the only thing in her life. She said she knew it. She said they knew it. She said there was no point pretending otherwise. People called those words pathetic for decades. I heard them differently. I heard a woman who had been beaten and arrested. No, he was arrested. But it always feels like both of you are arrested. That is something nobody says clearly enough. And tried by jury and found worthless and fired from her career, standing on a dock in New York City with nothing left to protect, and saying the only true thing left to say. She loved him. It was ruinous. It was real. He sailed. She stood there and watched the ship go. I will tell you what happened to her after, briefly, because it is important, and because it is hard, and because she deserves to have it said. She went to France. She went to London, found him there, and he hurt her again. The records confirm that by December 1924, he had resumed drinking and resumed the violence. In early 1925, she ended it finally. She went to Germany, made 17 films under a new name, Imogene Robertson, and a German studio offered her $1,500 a week because they understood what she could do. She came back to America in 1927. She became Mary Nolan. She signed with Universal Pictures. She worked. But the years that came after kept asking her to pay for the years that had come before. There was another man, Eddie Mannix, an MGM executive, who she said beat her badly enough to require months of hospitalization and left her dependent on morphine. There were overdoses, a bankruptcy, a marriage that failed, small roles in smaller pictures still. She died October 31st, 1948. Halloween, found in her Hollywood apartment, an overdose of Seconal. The coroner wrote, accidental or suicide. Among her possessions, an antique piano that had once belonged to Rudolph Valentino. The piano was sold in an estate sale. Now go back to the beginning. Go back to the stage of the New Amsterdam Theatre. Go back to his hand, and her head turning, and her finding her footing and standing still. Go back to everyone who was standing in those wings and found somewhere else to look. She stood on that stage, and nobody moved. That is where it started. That is the whole story, compressed into one image. Nobody moved. She tried to write it all down. Near the end of her life, in 1941, she sold the story to a newspaper, the American Weekly, and it ran in installments under the title Confessions of a Follies Girl. She was going to expand it into a memoir. She never finished. She died 7 years later with the story still unfinished. I think about that. The woman who had been a Ziegfeld girl, a film actress, a scandal, a verdict, a name that got changed 3 times to outrun its own history, sitting down at the end of all of it and trying to put the truth on paper, trying to give herself the last word, finally, after everyone else had taken so many turns with her story. She didn't get to finish. I want to say something carefully about my own part in what happened to her, because I have lived with it for a long time, and I have come to a position that is not self-pity and is not absolution. It is just the position I have arrived at after enough years. The walls were real. What could be done in 1924 by a black domestic worker in a courtroom against a white Broadway star? That was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of architecture. The building was designed to produce that verdict. We walked in with the truth, and the building did what it was built to do. And there were mornings at the dressing table where I looked at her in the mirror, and I did not say what I was seeing. There were evenings in the back hall where I heard something starting, and I stayed where I was. There was a morning before a courtroom where I said you look fine when what I meant was I see you. I have always seen you, and I am sorry I did not say so sooner. Both things are true. The architecture failed her, and I kept some of my voice for myself when I should have given it to her. What I want the world to know, and I am saying this directly because she cannot, she was not a cautionary tale. That is the story that was told about her. The girl who made bad choices, the showgirl who brought it on herself, the woman who kept going back. That story is a convenience. It is the story you tell when you don't want to examine the room. She was a girl from Louisville, Kentucky, who built herself from nothing, who earned a place on the most celebrated stage in America, who was funny and careful and serious and kind in the ways that actually mean something, who fell in love with a man who hurt her, went to the law, showed the law her bruises, brought a witness with bruises of her own, and was told it wasn't enough. She wasn't destroyed by bad choices. She was destroyed, methodically, by men who were protected by systems built to protect them, and by rooms full of people who found somewhere else to look. And then she rebuilt herself. And then it happened again. And she rebuilt herself again. She kept rebuilding until she couldn't anymore. She deserved someone who stayed in the room. She deserved a jury that looked at the bruises and decided they were enough. She deserved to keep the first name she was given. Imogene Robertson, Louisville, Kentucky. December 18th, 1902. She had a face that made people stop. Not because she was performing, just because there was something in it that you couldn't account for. Like deep water, like stillness. She deserved a life as quiet as that face. She didn't get it. But she was here. She mattered. And if you ask me what I want, after all of it, after 50 years of carrying the weight of what I saw and what I didn't do, and what nobody in that room was willing to do, I want you to know her real name.